It was a quiet morning as Emma sat by her window, staring out at the empty streets. The stillness was comforting, but something stirred within her, an urge to escape the daily routine. She had spent countless days in the same pattern, and now something needed to change. "Emma, come downstairs," her mother called from the kitchen. Emma sighed and reluctantly got up. "Coming, Mom," she called back. She quickly dressed and made her way downstairs, where the smell of freshly baked bread greeted her. As she entered the kitchen, her mother smiled. "You're up early today." "Yeah, just felt like getting out of bed," Emma replied, though she didn't mention the feeling of restlessness that had been gnawing at her. After a quick breakfast, she grabbed her jacket and keys. "I'm going out for a walk," she said, heading for the door. "Be safe," her mother called after her. Emma stepped out, the crisp air hitting her face as she walked down the empty street. She didn't have a destination in mind, but her feet seemed to guide her. After walking for a while, she found herself at the bus stop. Impulsively, she got on the first bus that arrived. The bus drove through familiar neighborhoods, but soon Emma noticed the surroundings becoming less recognizable. Buildings turned to fields, and busy streets turned into quiet country roads. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of freedom, even though she had no idea where she was headed. "Where are you going today?" asked the bus driver as they reached the last stop. Emma paused, realizing she hadn't thought this far ahead. "I don't know," she said with a smile. "Wherever this takes me." The driver chuckled. "Well, this is the end of the line for me, but there's a trail up ahead that leads into the forest. Lots of people go there to clear their heads." Feeling adventurous, Emma decided to explore the trail. She thanked the driver and started walking, her mind drifting as she ventured deeper into the woods. The sounds of birds and the rustle of leaves surrounded her, and soon she found herself lost, not in a worrying way, but in a way that felt liberating. As she walked, Emma came across a small clearing with a bench. She sat down, enjoying the peacefulness of the moment. She thought about how she had always lived her life cautiously, never stepping too far out of her comfort zone. But now, something inside her was shifting. Maybe this journey was about more than just clearing her head. Maybe it was about finding herself. Just as she was lost in thought, a voice interrupted her. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Emma looked up to see an older woman standing nearby. She hadn't noticed anyone approaching. "Yes, it is," Emma replied, smiling. The woman sat down beside her. "I've been coming here for years," she said, "whenever I need to think." Emma nodded. "I came here without any real plan, just felt like I needed a change." The woman chuckled softly. "Sometimes the best journeys are the ones we don't plan." They sat in comfortable silence for a while before the woman stood up to leave. "Take care, dear," she said, waving goodbye as she walked back down the trail. Emma stayed a little longer, reflecting on the woman's words. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to embrace the unplanned parts of life. With renewed energy, Emma stood up and began her walk back. The forest didn't feel quite as unfamiliar anymore. As she reached the edge of the woods, she saw the bus waiting at the stop. She boarded it, feeling lighter than she had in days. When she arrived back home, her mother was surprised to see her return so soon. "How was your walk?" she asked. Emma smiled. "It was just what I needed." And for the first time in a long while, she felt that everything was going to be okay, even if she didn't know what would come next. Chapter 1. The Mysterious Map. Lily sat by the window, watching the rain as it fell in heavy sheets against the glass. She had planned to spend the day outside, but the weather had other ideas. With nothing else to do, she wandered into the attic, a place she rarely explored. The attic was dusty and cluttered with old boxes and forgotten items. As Lily rummaged through the piles of old things, something caught her eye, a small leather-bound book lying on top of a broken chest. She picked it up and flipped through the pages, finding most of them blank, except for one near the end. There, on the worn paper, was a hand-drawn map. It was old, the ink faded, but the markings were clear enough to make out. A winding path, a large oak tree, and an X marked in the middle of a clearing. Lily's curiosity piqued. "What is this?" she whispered to herself, her fingers tracing the lines of the map. Excited by the discovery, she quickly ran downstairs to show her grandfather, who was sitting by the fire, reading. "Grandpa, look what I found in the attic," she said, thrusting the book into his hands. Her grandfather put on his glasses and examined the map. His eyes widened slightly as a small smile crept across his face. "Well, I haven't seen this in years," he said, looking up at her. "Do you know what it is?" Lily asked eagerly. Her grandfather nodded slowly. "This is a map to a place I used to visit when I was your age. It's in the forest beyond the hill, but I haven't been there in decades." Lily's excitement grew. "What's at the X?" "Treasure." Her grandfather chuckled. "No, not treasure, but something just as valuable, memories." "Memories?" Lily asked, confused. "Yes," he said, his eyes far away as if recalling a distant memory. "That clearing is where my friends and I used to meet when we were young. We'd spend entire summers exploring, playing, and just being kids. Those were some of the best days of my life." Lily was captivated. "Do you think it's still there? Can we go find it?" Her grandfather looked out the window at the rain. "Maybe once the weather clears. It's been a long time, but I'm sure the path is still there." The next day, the rain had stopped, and the sky was a bright, clear blue. Lily and her grandfather set out, map in hand, to find the forgotten place. They walked through the familiar fields and up the hill, the map guiding them. As they reached the edge of the forest, her grandfather slowed down, his eyes scanning the area. "The oak tree," he murmured. "It should be around here somewhere." Lily looked around and spotted a towering tree with thick, gnarled branches. "Is that it?" she asked, pointing. Her grandfather's face lit up. "That's the one." They followed the map's directions, weaving through the trees and underbrush until they reached the clearing. As they stepped into the open space, her grandfather stopped and smiled. "This is it," he said softly. "This is where we used to come." Lily looked around. The clearing was quiet, peaceful, and untouched by time. It wasn't anything grand or magical, but she could feel the history of the place, the laughter of children, the joy of adventure, all hidden within the quiet stillness. Her grandfather walked over to a large rock in the center of the clearing and sat down. "We used to sit here for hours, talking about the future, about what we'd become." He looked at Lily and smiled. "Funny how life takes you in directions you never expected." Lily sat next to him, feeling the weight of his words. "Do you miss it? Being young?" He shook his head. "No, not really. I've had a good life. But it's nice to come back and remember." They sat in silence for a while, just enjoying the moment. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the clearing. "We should come back here more often," Lily said, breaking the silence. Her grandfather nodded. "Yes, we should." As they walked back home, Lily realized that sometimes the most valuable things aren't hidden treasures or grand adventures, but the memories we make along the way. Chapter 1: The Enchanted Key. Sam had always loved exploring old, forgotten places. The small village where he lived was full of them, abandoned barns, overgrown gardens, and crumbling ruins that whispered secrets of the past. But none had intrigued him as much as the old mansion on the hill. No one had lived there for years, and rumors about the place were plenty. Some said it was haunted, others claimed it was cursed. Sam didn't believe in any of that, he just saw it as an adventure waiting to happen. One sunny afternoon, Sam made up his mind to finally explore the mansion. He packed a small backpack with essentials, his flashlight, a bottle of water, and a snack, and set off up the hill. As he approached the grand iron gates, his heart began to race. The gates were rusted and slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. "Here goes nothing," Sam muttered, pushing the gates open and stepping onto the overgrown path. The mansion loomed ahead, its once grand stone facade now covered in ivy and moss. Windows were cracked, and the large wooden door hung slightly off its hinges. But something about the place still felt alive, like it was waiting for someone to discover its secrets. Sam cautiously pushed open the front door and stepped inside. The floor creaked under his feet, and dust filled the air. But he pressed on, exploring each room. There was nothing particularly remarkable, just old furniture covered in sheets, broken picture frames, and the smell of damp wood. He was about to give up and leave when something in the corner of the living room caught his eye. It was a small, ornate chest, tucked behind a dusty old chair. Curious, Sam knelt down and opened it. Inside, there was nothing but a small, silver key. A key, Sam said aloud, turning it over in his hand. It didn't seem like much, but something about it felt special, almost enchanted. He pocketed the key and decided to search the rest of the house for whatever it might unlock. Room after room, door after door, Sam searched, but nothing fit the key. Finally, he reached the last door at the end of a narrow hallway. It was a small, unassuming door, almost hidden by the shadows. Sam hesitated for a moment, then took out the key. To his surprise, it slid into the lock perfectly. With a soft click, the door swung open, revealing a spiral staircase leading down into darkness. "This is it," Sam whispered, his heart racing with excitement and a little fear. He switched on his flashlight and started descending the stairs. The air grew colder as he went deeper underground, and the stone walls were damp and rough under his fingers. Finally, he reached the bottom, where he found himself standing in a large underground chamber. In the center of the room stood an ancient-looking pedestal, and on top of it sat a glowing crystal orb. The light from the orb bathed the chamber in a soft, eerie glow, and Sam felt an overwhelming urge to reach out and touch it. But as he stepped closer, a voice echoed through the chamber. "Who dares to disturb the Guardian's rest?" Sam froze. "Oh, I didn't mean to disturb anyone," he said, looking around for the source of the voice. "I was just curious." A figure began to materialize in front of the pedestal. It was a tall, shadowy figure, cloaked in dark robes with glowing eyes. "Curiosity brings many here, but few leave," the figure said, its voice cold and echoing. Sam swallowed hard, but something inside him refused to back down. "What is this place?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "This is the Chamber of the Guardian," the figure replied. "Long ago, this orb was placed here to protect the village from the darkness that once threatened it. Only those who are pure of heart may take it." Sam glanced at the glowing orb, then back at the figure. "Pure of heart," he repeated. "What happens if I take it and I'm not?" The figure's glowing eyes narrowed. "Then the darkness will consume you." For a moment, Sam thought about turning around and leaving. But something told him this was important, that he had found the key for a reason. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I believe I'm supposed to take it," Sam said confidently, though his heart pounded in his chest. The figure watched him silently as he reached out and placed his hand on the orb. The moment his fingers touched the crystal, a wave of warmth spread through him, and the light from the orb flared brightly. Then, just as quickly, the light faded, and the figure spoke again. "You are worthy." Sam exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "What now?" he asked. The figure's voice softened. "The darkness has returned to the land, but with the orb in your hands, you have the power to protect it once more. Use it wisely, for it holds great strength." Before Sam could ask more, the figure slowly dissolved into the shadows, leaving him alone with the glowing orb. Sam stood there for a moment, holding the orb and feeling the weight of what had just happened. The mansion, the key, the chamber, it all made sense now. He had been chosen. With the orb tucked safely under his arm, Sam made his way back up the stairs and out of the mansion. The sky was already beginning to darken, but as he looked out over the village, he knew one thing for sure. This adventure was only just beginning. Chapter 1: The Lost Village. Maya had always been fascinated by mysteries, and her small town was full of them. From strange disappearances in the woods to whispered rumors about cursed lands, it was a place where old tales and legends seemed to come alive. But the most intriguing of all was the legend of the Lost Village, a place that had supposedly vanished without a trace centuries ago. For as long as she could remember, Maya had heard stories about the Lost Village. No one knew where it was or what had happened to its inhabitants. Some said it had been swallowed by the earth. Others claimed it was hidden by magic. But what everyone agreed on was that the village was cursed, and anyone who tried to find it never returned. One afternoon, while browsing through the local library, Maya came across an old, weathered book hidden at the back of a dusty shelf. The title, The Forgotten Path, caught her eye. She flipped through the pages, her heart racing as she realized it was about the lost village. The village lies beyond the forest, where the river splits into two, the book read. Only those who seek it with pure intent will find the path. Maya couldn't believe her luck. This was the first real clue she had ever found about the village. Determined to uncover the truth, she packed a small bag with essentials and set off early the next morning. The air was crisp as Maya made her way through the dense forest, following the directions from the book. The deeper she ventured, the more the forest seemed to close in around her. The trees were taller here, their branches twisting like claws overhead, and the light barely filtered through the thick canopy. After what felt like hours of walking, Maya reached the river. It flowed peacefully, its waters clear and cool, and just as the book had said, it split into two paths. She took a deep breath and crossed a small wooden bridge, choosing the path that led deeper into the woods. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her. The forest was unnervingly quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects absent. But Maya pressed on, determined to find the village. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she emerged into a clearing. There, hidden by overgrown vines and moss-covered stones, was a small cluster of buildings. The lost village. Maya stood frozen for a moment, hardly able to believe what she was seeing. The houses were old and crumbling, their windows dark and empty, as if the village had been abandoned for centuries. The air here was thick with an eerie stillness, and the shadows seemed to shift around her, as though the village itself was watching her arrival. She slowly made her way to the center of the village, where a large stone well stood. Something about it seemed out of place, too new, too well-preserved. Maya knelt down to examine the well more closely. As she did, she noticed strange symbols carved into the stone. They were unlike anything she had ever seen before. Suddenly, she heard a sound behind her, a soft rustling, like footsteps on dry leaves. Maya spun around, but there was no one there. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed away from the well, her instincts screaming at her to leave. But she couldn't. Not yet. She took a deep breath and stepped closer to the well. Inside, the water was dark and still, reflecting the faint light of the afternoon. As she leaned over the edge to get a better look, something strange happened. The water began to ripple, though no wind stirred, and an image started to form on the surface. Maya gasped. The image showed a group of people, villagers, gathered around the well. They looked happy alive. But then, as she watched, the scene darkened. Shadows fell over the village, and the people's expressions turned to fear. One by one, they disappeared into the shadows, until only the well remained, standing alone in the darkness. Maya. A voice, soft and distant, echoed through the clearing. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She looked around, but saw no one. The voice called again, this time closer. Maya. Her name. Someone or something was calling her. She felt a chill run down her spine as the shadows around the village seemed to grow darker, closing in on her. Without thinking, Maya turned and ran. She dashed through the village, her feet pounding against the ground as she headed back toward the forest. The shadows followed, twisting and shifting, always just behind her. She didn't stop until she reached the river. Breathing heavily, Maya collapsed by the water's edge. The forest was still again, the shadows gone. She looked back, but the path to the village had disappeared, swallowed by the trees. Shaking, Maya pulled the old book from her bag. She flipped to the last page, the one she hadn't read before. Her heart sank as she read the final line. Once you find the village, it will never let you go. Chapter 1. The Clockmaker's Secret. In the heart of the old town, nestled between a bakery and a cobbler's shop, stood a small clockmaker's workshop. The sign above the door read Fletcher's Fine Timepieces, and it had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Mr. Fletcher, the clockmaker, was known throughout the town for his skill in crafting intricate, beautiful clocks, some small enough to fit in the palm of your hand, others towering tall enough to brush the ceiling. But what truly made Mr. Fletcher unique wasn't just his clocks. It was the rumors. Everyone in town whispered about the clockmaker's mysterious creations. Some claimed he could stop time with his clocks. Others said his clocks were enchanted, able to predict the future. But no one had ever proved these tales to be true, and Mr. Fletcher himself never spoke of it. One day, a young girl named Clara stood outside the shop, staring at the display in the window. She had always been fascinated by the clocks, the way they ticked in perfect harmony, as if they were keeping time not just for the town but for something much larger. Clara had visited the shop many times with her father when she was younger, but she hadn't been inside since he passed away. As she stood there, lost in thought, the door to the shop creaked open, and Mr. Fletcher appeared, his eyes twinkling behind a pair of round glasses. "Ah, Clara," he said in his soft, gravelly voice. "It's been a while. Why don't you come in?" Clara hesitated but nodded. Stepping inside the dimly lit shop, the air smelled of wood and oil, and the soft ticking of countless clocks filled the space. It was just as she remembered, calm, orderly, and filled with the feeling that time itself was woven into the walls. "Looking for something in particular?" Mr. Fletcher asked, moving behind the counter. Clara shook her head. "Just looking," she replied, her eyes wandering to a large clock on the back wall. It was unlike any she had seen before. Its face was carved with intricate designs, and its hands were made of delicate silver, slowly ticking away. But what drew her in was the center, a faint glowing symbol that seemed to pulse with every tick. "That one's special," Mr. Fletcher said, following her gaze. "It's not for sale, though." "What's so special about it?" Clara asked, curious. Mr. Fletcher smiled. "That clock can show you a glimpse of your future. Only for a moment, though. Just enough to change your path if you're brave enough." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "Is that true? Can it really do that?" Mr. Fletcher didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to the clock and gently traced his fingers over the face. "Time is a tricky thing, Clara. We like to think we control it, but really, it controls us. This clock, it gives you a chance. A glimpse. But once you see it, there's no going back." Clara's mind raced. A chance to see the future? To know what was coming? The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. "Can I try it?" she asked, almost without thinking. Mr. Fletcher studied her for a moment, then nodded. "If you're sure." He stepped aside, allowing her to approach the clock. Clara swallowed hard and took a step forward, her eyes locked on the glowing symbol at its center. She raised her hand slowly, hesitating for just a second before pressing her palm against the cool, smooth surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the clock began to hum softly, and the room seemed to fade away. Clara felt a rush of air, and suddenly, she was standing in a place she didn't recognize. She was older, maybe 5 or 6 years older, standing in a large room filled with people. They were laughing, talking, celebrating something. Clara looked around, confused, when she caught a glimpse of herself in a mirror on the wall. She was dressed in a beautiful gown, and in her hand, she held a bouquet of flowers. Her heart pounded as she realized what was happening. This was her wedding day. Before she could process it, the vision shifted, and she saw another scene. This time, she was standing on the edge of a cliff, overlooking a vast ocean. The wind whipped through her hair, and in her hands, she held a small clock, one of Mr. Fletcher's creations. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, and for the first time in her life, she felt completely free. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the vision faded, and Clara was back in the shop, her hand still pressed against the clock. She stepped back, her heart racing, and looked at Mr. Fletcher, who was watching her closely. What was that?" she asked, her voice shaky. "That," Mr. Fletcher said quietly, "was a glimpse of your future." Clara's mind was spinning. She had seen so much, so many possibilities. But what did it all mean? "You have a choice now," Mr. Fletcher continued. "The future is never set in stone. You've seen what could be, but it's up to you to decide how you get there, or if you want to change it." Clara didn't know what to say. The future she had seen was beautiful, but it was also unknown, full of risks and choices she hadn't yet made. Could she really change her path if she wanted to? "Take your time," Mr. Fletcher said softly. "The future will wait for you, but it won't wait forever." Clara nodded slowly, her mind swirling with possibilities. As she left the shop and stepped back into the sunlight, she realized that the future, no matter what it held, was hers to shape. And for the first time, she felt ready to face it. Chapter 1. The Whispering Lantern. Finn had always been drawn to the sea. Growing up in a small coastal village, he spent most of his days wandering the shoreline, collecting seashells, and watching the waves crash against the rocks. The villagers often told stories of strange happenings out at sea, of ships disappearing and mysterious creatures lurking in the deep, but Finn never paid them much mind. To him, the sea was a place of beauty and adventure, not danger. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Finn noticed something unusual washed up on the shore. Among the usual driftwood and seaweed was an old, weathered lantern, its glass cracked and covered in salt. Intrigued, Finn picked it up, brushing away the grime to reveal intricate carvings along the metal frame. There was something oddly familiar about the lantern, though he couldn't quite place why. As Finn held it in his hands, he thought he heard something. Soft whispers, like the faint murmur of voices carried by the wind. He shook his head, thinking it was just the sound of the waves. But as he turned to leave, the whispers grew louder, clearer. "Help us, find us." Finn froze. He looked around, but there was no one nearby. The beach was deserted, and the whispers seemed to be coming from the lantern itself. "What in the world?" Finn muttered, holding the lantern up to his ear. The voices grew even more distinct. "Follow the light. We are lost. Find us." A chill ran down Finn's spine. He had heard the stories of ghost ships and lost souls at sea, but this was something else. He should have tossed the lantern back into the waves and walked away, but his curiosity got the better of him. With a deep breath, he decided to take the lantern home. That night, as Finn lay in bed, the lantern sat on his bedside table, its soft whispers filling the room. He couldn't sleep. His mind was racing with thoughts of what the voices meant. He knew he had to find out more. The next morning, Finn went to see old Yora, the village's oldest and wisest fisherman. Yora had spent decades at sea and knew every legend and tale the waters had to offer. If anyone knew about the strange lantern, it would be him. Finn. Yora greeted him with a toothless smile as he sat outside his small cottage. "What brings you here, lad?" Finn hesitated before pulling the lantern out of his bag. "I found this on the shore last night. It whispers." Yora's smile faded as his eyes locked onto the lantern. "Let me see that," he said, his voice suddenly serious. Finn handed it over, and Yora examined it closely. His weathered fingers traced the carvings, and his eyes narrowed as if recalling a distant memory. "This lantern, it's part of an old tale one I haven't heard in years," Yora said slowly. "They call it the Whispering Lantern. It's said to have belonged to the crew of the Luna's Light, a ship that disappeared at sea over a century ago." Finn's heart skipped a beat. Disappeared? What happened to them? Yora leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "No one knows for sure. The Luna's Light was carrying treasure, a cargo so valuable, many believed it was cursed. One stormy night, the ship vanished without a trace, and neither the crew nor the ship was ever seen again. Some say the souls of the crew are still out there, lost in the fog, searching for a way home." Finn glanced at the lantern in Yora's hands. "Do you think this could be from the Luna's Light? And the voices, are they the crew?" Yora nodded solemnly. It's possible. The legend says that if you follow the whispers of the lantern, it will guide you to the lost ship. But be warned, lad. Many have tried, and none have returned." Despite Yora's warning, Finn felt a surge of excitement. The idea of finding a long-lost ship, possibly even treasure, was too tempting to ignore. "What do I have to do?" Finn asked, his voice steady with determination. Yora sighed, his old eyes filled with concern. "You'll need to sail out into the open sea, beyond the safety of the coast. The lantern will guide you, but you must be careful. The sea has a way of playing tricks on those who seek what should remain lost." That evening, as the sun began to set, Finn prepared his small boat. He packed provisions, secured the lantern at the bow, and pushed off from the shore. The whispers had grown louder now, urging him to follow, to find the lost souls of the Luna's Light. The sea was calm at first, the stars reflecting off the surface like tiny diamonds. But as Finn sailed farther from the shore, the air grew colder, and a thick fog began to roll in. The whispers guided him through the mist, their tone growing more urgent. "Closer, we are near." Hours passed, and the fog only thickened. Finn could barely see a few feet in front of him, but he trusted the lantern to guide him. Suddenly, through the haze, he saw the faint outline of a massive ship. His heart raced. It was the Luna's light. The ship loomed ahead, its sails tattered and its hull worn by time. As Finn drew closer, the voices grew louder, filling his ears. "Help us, free us." With trembling hands, Finn steered his boat alongside the ghostly vessel. The air was heavy with an unnatural stillness, and the only sound was the creaking of the ship as it swayed in the water. Gathering his courage, Finn climbed aboard. The deck was eerily empty, but he could feel the presence of something, many somethings, watching him. The whispers were all around him now, filling the air with desperate pleas. "Release us, and the curse." Finn knew what he had to do. He took the lantern from his boat and held it high. The glow from the lantern brightened, illuminating the ship's deck. As the light grew stronger, the fog began to lift, and the voices started to fade. The ship shuddered beneath him, and Finn felt a strange warmth wash over him. The curse was breaking. In the distance, the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds. The Luna's light shimmered, and before Finn's eyes, it began to fade. Its time had finally come to an end. The last thing Finn heard before the ship disappeared into the mist was a soft, grateful whisper. "Thank you." Chapter 1: The Hidden Garden. Sophie had lived her whole life in the city, where the only greenery came from small parks or the potted plants lining apartment balconies. But all that changed when her family moved to the countryside. Their new home was an old stone house, surrounded by rolling hills and fields. It was beautiful, but Sophie wasn't sure how she felt about the quiet. She missed the hum of the city, the buzz of people and cars always moving, always alive. One afternoon, while exploring the grounds around her new home, Sophie came across something unexpected. At the far end of the overgrown garden, partially hidden by ivy, was an old wooden gate. It was worn and weathered, the paint peeling away, but it was locked tight with a rusty iron padlock. Curiosity sparked within her. Sophie loved stories of hidden places and secret worlds, and this gate felt like the beginning of one. She tried to open it, but the lock wouldn't budge. Frustrated, she turned to leave, but then she noticed something, a small, silver key lying on the ground near the base of the gate. It was as if it had been waiting for her. With a racing heart, Sophie picked up the key, slid it into the lock, and turned it. To her surprise, the old padlock clicked open with ease. She pushed the gate, and with a groan, it swung open, revealing a narrow path leading into a dense thicket of trees and vines. Sophie hesitated for a moment before stepping through the gate. The air inside felt different, cooler, quieter, like the world outside had been left behind. The path was overgrown but still visible, winding its way through the trees. She followed it, her excitement growing with each step. After a few minutes, the trees began to thin, and Sophie stepped into a large, open space. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a garden, unlike any she had ever seen. Flowers of every color bloomed in wild abundance, their petals glowing softly in the dappled sunlight. Ivy crept up ancient stone statues, and a fountain bubbled gently in the center of the garden. It was beautiful, untouched by time, and yet it felt alive, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. Sophie wandered through the garden in awe, her fingers brushing over the soft petals of the flowers. There was something magical about the place, something she couldn't quite explain. It was peaceful, yes, but there was also an energy in the air, a feeling that this garden was more than just a forgotten space. As she walked, Sophie noticed a bench tucked beneath a large willow tree. It was carved from stone, with intricate designs etched into the backrest. She sat down, soaking in the beauty around her. But as she sat, she began to notice something strange. The flowers seemed to move, just slightly, as if they were leaning toward her, listening. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her imagination. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A small figure darted between the flowers, a blur of color and light. Sophie jumped to her feet, her heart pounding. She scanned the garden, but everything was still again. "What was that?" she whispered. She took a cautious step forward, peering into the dense flowers. For a moment, she thought she saw it again. A tiny figure, no bigger than her hand, flitting among the blooms. It was almost like a fairy? Sophie blinked. No, that was impossible. Fairies didn't exist. But then she saw it again, clearer this time. A tiny creature, with delicate wings and a trail of shimmering light, hovering near the fountain. Sophie's mouth dropped open. No way. The fairy, or whatever it was, paused, as if noticing her for the first time. For a moment, they stared at each other in silence. Then, with a soft flutter of its wings, the fairy flew closer, stopping just in front of her. Sophie could hardly believe what she was seeing. The creature was beautiful, with iridescent wings that sparkled in the sunlight and tiny, graceful features. It hovered in the air for a moment before tilting its head and speaking in a voice that was barely louder than the rustling of leaves. "You found the hidden garden," the fairy said, its voice soft but clear. Sophie nodded, still too stunned to speak. "We have been waiting for someone like you," the fairy continued. "Someone who can help us." "Help you?" Sophie finally managed to say. "What do you mean?" The fairy glanced around the garden, its wings fluttering slightly. "This garden is old, much older than you can imagine. It is a place of magic and life, but something has disturbed the balance. The garden is slowly withering, and soon, all the magic will be gone." Sophie frowned, looking around. The garden didn't seem to be dying. It looked more vibrant and alive than any place she had ever seen. The fairy seemed to sense her confusion. "It is not visible yet, but it will be soon. The magic is fading. The flowers, the trees, even the fountain, they all depend on the magic of this place to survive. Without it, everything will wither." Sophie knelt down, her curiosity now mixed with concern. "How can I help?" The fairy's wings fluttered excitedly. "There is an old well in the heart of the garden, hidden beneath the oldest tree. The well is the source of the garden's magic. But something has blocked it, something dark. If you can find the well and remove the blockage, the magic will flow again." Sophie took a deep breath. "Okay, I'll help you." The fairy smiled, a soft glow surrounding it. "Thank you, Sophie." With that, the fairy led her deeper into the garden, where the flowers grew thicker and the air felt heavier. At the very center of the garden stood an ancient tree, its branches twisted and gnarled with age. Beneath its roots, hidden by thick vines, was a stone well. Sophie could feel the energy coming from the well, like a faint heartbeat, but it was weak, struggling. The vines around it pulsed with a strange, dark energy, as if they were choking the life out of the garden. Determined, Sophie began pulling the vines away, one by one. They were tough and resistant, but she didn't give up. Finally, after what felt like hours, she cleared the last vine, and the well shimmered with a soft, golden light. The garden around her seemed to sigh with relief. The flowers perked up, their colors growing brighter, and the air filled with the sweet scent of blossoms. The fountain bubbled stronger, and the magic of the garden flowed freely once more. The fairy hovered beside her, its wings glowing. "You've done it. You've saved the garden." Sophie smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. "It wasn't just me," she said. "The garden wanted to be saved." The fairy nodded. "And now it will thrive again, for you and for those who come after." Sophie stood, looking around at the vibrant, magical garden she had discovered. It was a secret she would keep, a place she would visit again and again, knowing that this hidden world was alive, waiting for her return. Chapter 1. The Silent Lighthouse. Ellie had always been drawn to the sea, just like her grandfather. Growing up, she spent her summers visiting him in his small cottage by the coast, listening to his stories about ships, storms, and the ancient lighthouse that stood on the rocky cliff nearby. The lighthouse had been abandoned for years, its light extinguished and its doors locked, but it still towered over the coastline like a silent sentinel. One summer, Ellie decided to spend a few weeks with her grandfather. She had been restless, looking for something, though she wasn't quite sure what. When she arrived, her grandfather greeted her with his usual warm smile, but there was something different about him this time. He seemed more distant, more preoccupied. "Grandpa," Ellie asked one evening as they sat by the fire, "what's been on your mind lately? You seem different." Her grandfather glanced out the window, where the silhouette of the lighthouse stood against the darkening sky. "It's the lighthouse, Ellie. I've been hearing things. Strange things." Ellie raised an eyebrow. "Strange things." Her grandfather nodded. "Voices. Sometimes at night, when the wind is just right, I hear whispers coming from the lighthouse. I thought I was imagining it at first, but it's been happening more often." Ellie was intrigued. She had always found the lighthouse fascinating, but now it seemed like there was more to it than just an old, abandoned structure. "What do the voices say?" she asked, her curiosity growing. Her grandfather shook his head. "I can't make out the words. It's like they're calling for help, but it's faint. I've been meaning to go up there and check it out, but..." He trailed off, his expression troubled. Ellie knew her grandfather well enough to know that he wouldn't tell her everything if he thought it would worry her. But she couldn't let it go. The idea of the silent lighthouse calling out into the night was too mysterious to ignore. That night, as the wind howled outside the cottage, Ellie lay in bed, unable to sleep. Her mind kept drifting back to the lighthouse. What if there really was something or someone there? She had to find out. The next morning, Ellie woke up before dawn. She dressed quickly, grabbed a flashlight, and left a note for her grandfather, just in case. Then, she headed out toward the cliff where the lighthouse stood. The walk was familiar, but the atmosphere felt different today. The sky was gray and heavy with the promise of rain, and the wind carried a strange, almost eerie chill. As Ellie reached the base of the lighthouse, she paused, staring up at its tall, weathered frame. The door was locked, just as she remembered, but the windows were dark and empty, giving the lighthouse an abandoned, forgotten air. Taking a deep breath, Ellie circled the building, searching for another way in. Behind the lighthouse, hidden by overgrown bushes, she found a small, rusted door. She hesitated for a moment before pushing it open with a loud creak. The air inside smelled damp and musty, but Ellie's heart raced with excitement as she stepped inside. The interior was just as old and neglected as she had imagined, dusty, with peeling paint and broken furniture scattered about. She shone her flashlight around the room, her beam landing on a spiral staircase that wound its way up to the top of the lighthouse. "Here we go," Ellie whispered to herself, making her way up the stairs. Each step echoed in the silence, the creaks of the wood adding to the eerie atmosphere. As she climbed higher, the air grew colder, and the feeling of being watched crept over her. She stopped for a moment, listening. Was that the wind, or was it something else? A faint, distant whisper seemed to echo around her, but she couldn't quite make out the words. At last, Ellie reached the top. The door to the lantern room was slightly ajar, and she pushed it open with trembling hands. Inside, the large glass windows provided a panoramic view of the stormy sea below. The lantern itself was covered in dust and cobwebs, its once bright light long extinguished. But something else caught her attention. In the corner of the room, half hidden in the shadows, stood an old wooden chest. It looked out of place, as if it had been left there long after the lighthouse had been abandoned. Ellie's heart pounded as she approached it. She knelt down, carefully lifting the lid. Inside, she found an assortment of papers, maps, and a leather-bound journal. The journal looked worn, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it, her hands shaking slightly, and began to read. The journal belonged to the last lighthouse keeper, a man named Thomas Whitaker. As she flipped through the pages, Ellie's eyes widened. The entries were filled with strange accounts. Thomas wrote about hearing whispers in the night, voices that seemed to come from the sea. He described sleepless nights and strange visions, and how he had eventually sealed something away inside the lighthouse. The final entry sent chills down Ellie's spine. The whispers grow louder each night. I've tried to ignore them, but they're inside my mind now. The sea, it wants something. Something I've hidden here. I don't know how much longer I can keep it at bay. If anyone finds this journal, know that I did what I could. The lantern, it holds the key. Ellie's hands shook as she set the journal aside. She glanced up at the lantern, her mind racing. What had Thomas hidden here? And what did the sea want? Just as she stood up to investigate further, A gust of wind rattled the windows, and the faint whispers filled the air once more. "Help us find it." Ellie turned toward the lantern. Was the secret hidden inside? She slowly approached the massive structure, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. At the base of the lantern, she found a small compartment, almost invisible in the shadows. With a soft click, the compartment opened, revealing a strange, glowing crystal inside. The light it emitted was faint but pulsed like a heartbeat. As Ellie reached for the crystal, the whispers grew louder, surrounding her. "Release us." Her fingers brushed the crystal, and suddenly, a rush of energy surged through her. The room seemed to blur around her, and for a moment, she saw something. An image of the sea, dark and vast, and within it, something ancient, something powerful. The vision faded, leaving Ellie breathless. She clutched the crystal in her hand, knowing that whatever this was, it was far from over. The lighthouse had been keeping a secret, and now, she had uncovered it. The question was, what would she do next? Subscribe for more videos. Your support helps me create more content. Thanks for watching.